The wind cut through the trees like a blade, thin and cold. Beneath the towering pines, the world felt too still, like the breath held before a scream. Mark pulled his jacket tighter, his eyes scanning the shadowed edges of the campsite. The fire crackled, flickering with unnatural bursts, sending shadows dancing against the black sky. His two companions, Sarah and Luke, sat huddled around the flames, their faces half-lit by the orange glow. Then a noise. A low, wet sound like a distant growl echoed from the forest. Mark's heart skipped. He'd been hearing things since the moment they'd set up camp. It was nothing, he told himself. Just animals. But the way the noise lingered stretched out like it was waiting for something. Someone had him on edge. "It's just the wind," Sarah muttered, trying to shake off the tension. But her voice cracked, a tremble hidden under her bravado. Mark stared into the dark, a shiver creeping up his spine. Another growl. This time closer. Much closer. And then, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though whatever was out there knew exactly how much terror it would create by simply moving. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Luke whispered, his eyes wide, darting toward the trees. A distant scream echoed, long and mournful. It cut through the night like a blade. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something was out there. The fire flickered and died. The air was still, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The wind that should have been howling down from the mountains was subdued, a whisper against the thick trunks of the pines. Mark tugged at his jacket, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. The fire crackled weakly, casting long shadows that stretched out over the campsite. He could almost hear them, the voices, just on the edge of his hearing. But every time he focused, the sounds disappeared into the dark. "Do you think it's safe?" Sarah's voice broke through the silence, thin and tense. Her eyes wide and wary. Never left the woods. She pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, as if the trees might swallow her whole if she wasn't careful. Mark glanced at her, trying to catch his breath in the cold, biting air. The fire was small, the flames too weak to push back the darkness that was creeping in. He forced himself to smile, but it felt wrong. Too tight, too forced. It wasn't the first time they'd been out in the wild. But it was the first time it had felt like this. Like the woods were alive, like they were aware of every step they took, every breath they exhaled. "We're fine," he said, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. "It's just a storm coming through. Nothing to worry about." Sarah didn't look convinced. She kept glancing over her shoulder into the trees, like she expected something, or someone to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "What if we're lost?" Luke's voice was quieter, but it had the same uneasy edge to it. He was staring down at the ground, kicking at a loose stone by his boot. His hands were shaking slightly as he fiddled with the strap on his backpack. Mark looked at Luke, then back at Sarah. They weren't the ones who had been insistent about the camping trip. That had been his idea, a way to get away from the chaos, to relax and unwind. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. But the longer they stayed out here, the more Mark felt a creeping sense of wrongness, something that slithered under his skin, chilling him from the inside out. "We're not lost," Mark said again, though the words felt empty this time. They hadn't seen another soul in hours, and the trail they'd come in on had vanished into the dense underbrush long ago. He hated how easy it had been to lose the path, to lose their way. "Just take it easy," he added, trying to sound more convincing. "We'll wake up early tomorrow, get back to the main trail." But even as he said it, a part of him knew it wouldn't be that simple. It never was. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above them, the sound sharp like whispers in the dark. Mark shivered involuntarily, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something move among the trees, a shape just out of the corner of his eye. He blinked and it was gone. His heart started pounding in his chest. Nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. Just relax, okay?" Mark said a little too quickly. "We'll be fine." Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze was locked on something. Something in the forest, something that was making the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand up. "It's too quiet," she murmured almost to herself. "It shouldn't be this quiet." Mark opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat when he heard it. A faint, distant sound. A low growl, the kind that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, like it was coming from something that wasn't supposed to be in the woods. Luke heard it too. His eyes flicked to Mark, wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Mark swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. "It's nothing." But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching, waiting. Another growl, closer this time. It wasn't a wild animal. Mark could feel it deep in his gut, the way it vibrated through the ground like a tremor of something ancient and powerful, something that didn't belong. "Maybe we should go," Sarah said, her voice small. "We should go now. It's not right. We should leave." Mark glanced at Luke, his hand still frozen on the strap of his backpack. He knew the suggestion was coming, but part of him didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to be the one to say it aloud, but deep down he could feel it. The pull of something wrong, something dark. "We can't leave. We're too far in," Mark said, his words more to himself than anyone else. "We'll be fine. We'll stick together." But Sarah's face was pale now, her mouth pressed tight. "Mark." There was a sound behind them, a rustling in the trees. Not the wind. Not the branches shifting. Something moving through the brush. Something large. Something that wasn't afraid of the dark. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He stood up, looking into the blackness, willing himself to see something. Anything beyond the fire's dim light. His breath came too fast, and the air felt thick, like it was closing in around him. Then came a scream. It was distant at first, carried on the wind, but it was a scream all the same. Long, mournful. Inhuman. It stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse than the scream. The darkness felt deeper now, pressing against him from all sides. The trees, once comforting, now seemed like silent sentinels, looming, waiting. Mark's mouth went dry, his legs shaky beneath him. This was no longer a simple camping trip. This wasn't just the wild. Something was out there. Something was coming. The cold was unrelenting. By the time Mark had forced his body into motion, hours had passed since the scream, but it still hung in the air, a muffled echo in the back of his mind. He hadn't said anything to Sarah or Luke after the scream. There hadn't been time. The forest was too still, too unnatural. The wind had picked up, but it carried with it a tension that felt wrong. The night was thick, heavy with something Mark couldn't name, and the sounds of the woods seemed to disappear the deeper they ventured into it. "You're sure we're on the trail?" Luke's voice cut through the silence, though it was strained, uncertain. He was walking a little too fast, his steps unsteady. Mark could hear the unease in his words, though he didn't want to admit it himself. "I'm sure," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He didn't know the woods. He didn't know how deep they had gone or how far off the trail had slipped. The map had been a vague suggestion, a recommendation at best. The thick trees and shadows swallowed any traces of familiarity. He tried to tell himself it was just the unknown, just the wilderness, but it felt like something more. Sarah was behind them, her feet dragging on the ground, her breath shallow. She didn't say anything, just moved along in silence. Mark hadn't seen her this quiet before. Her usual energy, the small bursts of sarcasm or laughter, had been swallowed by the same eerie, creeping fear that had settled into his bones. "There's something wrong," Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark turned to look at her, but she was staring straight ahead, her eyes darting toward the trees. Mark opened his mouth to tell her to stop, to remind her that they were fine, but the words caught in his throat. The air had changed again. It was thick, heavier than before. The chill didn't feel like the cold of night. It felt oppressive, like it was seeping into his skin, into his very bones. "What do you mean?" Luke asked, his voice sharper now. "Don't you feel it?" Sarah asked, almost frantic. "It's like the woods are watching us." Mark stiffened, the back of his neck prickling with a sudden awareness. He felt it too. There was no wind, no sounds of animals. Just Stillness. It wasn't natural. The only thing that moved was the slow sway of the trees, and even that seemed wrong, too deliberate, too measured. A sound broke the silence, a low, rumbling growl from somewhere deeper in the forest. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end. It was closer this time, unmistakably so. The growl reverberated through the ground, sinking deep into his chest, vibrating against his ribs like a warning. "There's something out there," Luke said, his voice now strained, edging on panic. Mark looked at him, his stomach sinking. "We need to keep moving. We don't stop. Keep your eyes forward." But as he spoke, Mark's eyes kept darting toward the shadows between the trees. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving out there. Something was following them. Not just in the way an animal might track them, but in a way that was deliberate, as though whatever it was knew exactly where they were. Knew exactly what they were feeling. Sarah's pace quickened, and Mark did his best to match it. His own heart was racing now. Every step felt like they were sinking deeper into the unknown. But the ground beneath their feet was uneven, the leaves crunching loudly with each movement. Mark's breaths came too quickly, too shallow. His head throbbed with a growing pressure. The pressure of being watched. Of something closing in. "We need to talk," Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with a strange, breathless fear. "Mark, this isn't normal. This place isn't normal." Luke glanced over his shoulder at Sarah, his eyes wide. "We're getting out of here, right?" "Of course," Mark said, trying to force his voice to stay calm. But he couldn't deny it anymore. The woods were different now. They weren't just trees. They were watching. They were waiting. The forest seemed to grow quieter, its heavy silence pressing in on them like a wall. The growl was louder now, unmistakably close. But it wasn't just the growl that unsettled Mark. It was the voices. They had started again. Faint, far off, like whispers carried on the wind. But there was something else in them, something that made his skin crawl. They weren't human. He caught Sarah's eye. "Don't listen to the voices," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah's face was pale, her lips trembling. She shook her head, but the look in her eyes told him everything. She could hear them too. They weren't just whispers in the trees. They were words. They were warnings. "Mark, we're not safe." Luke's voice cracked, and he was looking around them now, as if expecting something to jump from the trees. "We shouldn't be here. We need to get out now." "I know," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. "But the path, it's gone. We can't go back." Luke cursed under his breath, his hand gripping his pack tightly as if it could protect him. Sarah took a step back, her feet dragging as though she could sense the same thing. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the forest was shifting, changing. The trees seemed to grow closer, their trunks looming over them like silent sentinels. They had stopped moving forward, stopped walking in the direction they thought was safe. Now they were just standing there, lost in the vast, endless dark. And then it happened. A crack. Not the snap of a branch breaking. Not the rustle of leaves or wind pushing through the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, stepping on the ground just behind them. The earth trembled beneath their feet as if it had been disturbed by something massive, something heavy. Mark's heart stopped. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. But they all heard it. The slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer, closer. A voice, low and gravelly, rippled through the night. "Leave or die." Mark's blood froze in his veins. Sarah gasped, her hand shooting out toward him, her face pale, eyes wide in terror. Luke opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole, cut off their words and thoughts, left them alone in the suffocating silence, save for the growing presence of whatever had followed them. The air grew thicker, the weight of it pressing down on them like a blanket suffocating their every breath. The steps came closer, each one echoing in their ears. Mark didn't want to look. He didn't want to see it. But the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of a scream. It came from far off, but it wasn't human. The sound twisted and warbled, the pitch rising and falling, distorted like something trying to speak from the depths of a nightmare. And then it stopped. There was only silence. And the shadows. Mark's body screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen to the ground. His eyes were glued to the darkness just beyond the firelight, where the shadows stretched long and sharp, ready to consume him. "Mark!" Sarah's voice trembled, barely a whisper. "What do we do?" But he had no answer. The woods had swallowed their path, their safety, their hopes. And whatever was out there was closing in, waiting for them to make the first move. And when they did, it would be too late. The forest had never felt this alive. Not until now. Mark's legs were like lead, his body frozen in place as the sounds of the woods closed in around him. The wind had stopped, and for a brief moment the world felt too still, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Whatever was behind them was moving closer, its presence undeniable. The footsteps were slow but purposeful, like something stalking its prey, something that knew exactly how to instill fear. Sarah's face was ghostly white, her eyes wide and haunted as she gripped Mark's arm, her fingers trembling. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He tried to look behind him, but every instinct screamed for him not to. Every fiber of his being told him that to look was to invite whatever it was into their world. But he couldn't hold the terror inside anymore. The silence was suffocating. He had to know. "Mark, what's out there?" Luke's voice was barely audible, but it cut through the suffocating silence like a blade. Mark's throat was dry, his eyes locked on the blackness that loomed just beyond the small circle of firelight. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I think it's coming for us." The air grew colder, so cold that Mark could see his breath in short, sharp clouds. His teeth chattered, but it wasn't the cold that made him shake. It was the growing sense of dread, the feeling that whatever hunted them was getting closer. He forced himself to take a step forward, then another. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if there was any way out of this place. But he couldn't stand still any longer. The moment he moved, the growl came again. It was louder this time, deeper, a low, resonating sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Mark stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything from this world. He could feel it in his bones. Whatever it wasn't bound by the same rules. The growl faded, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed in around them, suffocating, unnatural. The only thing they could hear now was their own breathing. Shallow, panicked. Luke was crouched, his head jerking every which way, scanning the darkness. Sarah had her hands pressed to her ears, as if she could block out the sound of her own fear. Then the footsteps came again. Closer. This time louder. The sound of something heavy, something large, moving with purpose. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, the terror in her eyes unmistakable. "I don't want to die here." Mark couldn't answer. His throat had gone dry, his mind spinning with fear, but one thing became clear. Whatever was out there, it wasn't letting them go. It was closing in, tightening around them like a noose. A figure emerged from the shadows. Mark's breath caught in his throat as it stepped into the flickering light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form hunched and grotesque. Its skin was gray and mottled, slick with something that shimmered under the firelight, like oil. Its head was too large for its body, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to swallow all light. Its mouth was a jagged mess of teeth, sharp and twisted, like a nightmare made flesh. It was not human. It was not anything Mark had ever seen. The figure stood still for a moment, its head tilting to one side as if studying them. And then it moved. Its legs were unnaturally long, its steps heavy, each one resounding like a drumbeat in the silence. It moved with purpose, each movement slow and deliberate. Mark's legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he stood frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature in front of him. And then it spoke. "Leave. Or die." The words were not spoken in a voice, but in a grinding sound, a low rumble that felt like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. The ground shook beneath Mark's feet, the trees groaning as if the entire forest were alive, responding to the presence of this thing. Mark's pulse raced in his ears. "We need to run," he gasped, his voice hoarse. But before he could take another step, the figure lunged. The air crackled, thick with energy, and the creature's hand shot out, impossibly fast, its claws scraping through the air like lightning. It reached for Luke, but Mark was faster. He grabbed Luke's arm and yanked him backward, pulling him away from the grasping claws that seemed to tear the very air apart. The world went into slow motion. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the creature's claws slash toward them. But instead of tearing Luke apart, they seemed to stop, like an invisible wall was holding them back. Mark's mind raced, his eyes flicking from the creature's horrid, jagged face to the flickering fire that was rapidly dying. The flames danced wildly, casting an eerie glow over the forest as the creature slowly advanced, its steps measured and deliberate. Another growl, this one more like a guttural laugh, rumbled from the depths of the creature's throat. It leaned closer, its eyes fixed on Mark, its gaze almost knowing. And then the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The earth split open. Mark's stomach lurched as a deep, cavernous crack spread beneath them, a rift that seemed to stretch toward the very heart of the earth. The trees shuddered as if they, too, were feeling the pulse of whatever force was awakening beneath them. The creature stepped back, a low, satisfied rumble escaping its throat. Luke screamed, his voice raw with panic, as he grabbed Sarah's hand and tried to pull her away from the growing chasm. But Mark couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his legs locked in place, his eyes fixed on the rift that had appeared beneath them. The crack widened, and from it came a low, shrill sound, like the voice of something ancient and hungry. The earth seemed to split open wider, revealing the dark, black void beneath. Mark could see something moving down there. Shadows twisting, writhing. The sounds grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever had been trapped below was finally breaking free. The figure took another step forward, its presence growing more powerful, more real. It was no longer just a creature, it was a force. A being of darkness, of hunger. It wasn't just hunting them, it was feeding on their fear. "We have to go," Mark finally managed to say, his voice breaking as he forced himself to look away from the rift. "Now." He turned, pulling Luke and Sarah with him. But they weren't fast enough. Before they could take another step, the air around them shifted, like the forest itself had turned against them. The rift widened even more, and from it came a low, horrific wail, a sound like something breaking, something not meant to be heard by human ears. And then they were falling. Mark didn't have time to scream. The ground beneath him gave way, and the world collapsed into darkness. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure standing at the edge of the chasm, its twisted face watching them fall, a cruel, knowing smile stretching across its features. And then nothing. Mark's eyes fluttered open to darkness. It was a weightless blackness that pressed down on him from all sides, a void that threatened to swallow him whole. His body ached, bruised and battered, but the pain was distant, almost muffled, as though he was floating outside of himself. His breaths were shallow, ragged. The air tasted stale, heavy and cold, like it hadn't moved in years. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of the darkness around him. The stillness of it all unsettled him. His hand reached out, fingers brushing the ground beneath him. It was hard, rough like stone, but there was something wrong about it, something off. Panic began to rise in his chest. He pushed himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain in his ribs, the pounding in his head. His heart raced as he forced himself to stand, but his legs were weak, unsteady. He stumbled, his hands bracing against the cold surface around him. It felt like he was underground, buried, and the thought alone made his throat tighten. "Sarah." "Luke." His voice broke the silence, but it felt fragile, small. His words vanished into the oppressive blackness, swallowed up like they were never spoken at all. There was no answer, no movement, no sound at all except for his ragged breath. Mark's heart pounded harder. He tried to call out again, but his throat tightened, his voice catching in his chest. His stomach lurched with nausea, the world spinning around him, but he refused to fall again. Not now. Not like this. He forced himself to look around, scanning the shadows, trying to pick out any sign of light, any trace of his friends. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, but there was something in it. Something moving. A shimmer. A faint glimmer of light in the distance. Mark didn't think. He moved toward it instinctively. his steps hesitant but urgent. The air was colder now, sharper as he pushed forward, and his skin prickled with a familiar sense of dread. The rift, he remembered it now, the ground splitting open beneath their feet. The scream, the dark figure, the blackness rising from the depths of the earth. It hadn't been a dream. It hadn't been his imagination. The fear began to claw at his chest again, but he kept moving. He had to. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. The glimmer of light grew brighter, and Mark's heart skipped a beat as he stumbled forward, his breath catching. His eyes strained against the shadows, and then, through the gloom, he saw it, a faint, glowing shape that seemed to pulse in time with his heart. It was a figure, one he could barely make out in the darkness. Tall, unfamiliar. Its shape was blurred, its edges shifting, almost like a mirage in the heat. Mark froze, his eyes widening. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Luke. "Who's there?" he croaked, his voice trembling in the heavy air. The figure didn't answer. It only moved, slow and deliberate, like it was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. Mark stepped backward, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen, caught in the pull of the darkness. The figure's presence was overwhelming, and for a moment, Mark thought it was going to reach out to grab him. But instead, the figure simply stood there, unmoving, its outline flickering in and out of focus. Mark's breath caught in his throat as it began to change. The light flickered once more, and suddenly the shape was clear. No longer a blur, but a face twisted and contorted. A face that was both familiar and foreign, like a memory that refused to settle. And then it spoke. "Mark." His blood ran cold as the voice echoed in his mind, low and hollow, but it wasn't the voice he'd expected. It was distorted, garbled, as though it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Something old, something cursed. "Mark, you were always meant to be here." He shook his head violently, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The figure's face twisted in an inhuman smile, its eyes hollow and dark, watching him with an unnatural knowing. Mark's hands trembled as they clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but inexorable. It reached out, its long fingers stretching toward him. Mark backed away, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the earth tilting in ways it shouldn't. He stumbled again, his mind spinning. "You belong to it now," the figure's voice continued, chilling and certain. "You always have." The words echoed in his mind like a mantra, growing louder with each breath he took. And then, the world around him began to crack. The darkness splintered. Mark gasped as the air grew cold, colder than before, frost creeping along the edges of the blackness. The figure loomed larger, its face now impossibly close, and the terror in Mark's chest erupted into pure panic. He wasn't sure if he could breathe anymore. The walls of the world were closing in, crushing him, suffocating him with their weight. And then, with a violent crack, the world shattered. He fell forward, his body crashing against the cold, hard ground. He opened his eyes again, gasping for air, but there was no time to think, no time to process what had just happened. The world around him had split open once more, the rift widening, and there was no escape. He reached out, his hands trembling, but all he could feel was cold emptiness. A void. The dark was consuming everything. But there was something else now. A sound, a faint whisper in the back of his mind, a memory. He could hear it clear as day. "Leave or die." Mark staggered to his feet, his vision blurry. He could hear Sarah's voice now, calling his name, but it sounded distant, so far away. "Mark, Mark, where are you?" Her voice was thin, frantic, the kind of voice that belonged to someone on the edge of breaking. He reached out to her, his limbs shaking, but when he turned, the world around him spun again, and the shadows swallowed her voice. It was gone. The world was silent. There was no fire, no trail, no presence of the forest that had once been. Just a vast, infinite emptiness. The figure stood still, its eyes never leaving him. "You were never meant to leave." Mark's body trembled. his mind reeling with the unbearable weight of the truth. The forest wasn't just the forest. It wasn't just a place. It was a thing, alive, ancient, feeding, watching, waiting. And Mark had become part of it. The world was changing around him. The darkness swirled like a storm, its edges pulling at him, trying to swallow him whole. Mark's chest tightened, his breath shallow. There was no way out. Not anymore. He had crossed the line, and now there was no return. No one would ever know what happened here. The forest would claim him, and he would be lost to it forever. He felt it then, the cold, suffocating darkness, closing in, wrapping around him. The last breath he took was slow, shallow, a whispered cry to the void. And then silence. The rift closed. And Mark was gone,